Welcome to this week's video. We are going to be doing some editing on the iPad, specifically looking at the new color grading panels that Adobe rolled out for Lightroom just this fall. But make sure and stick around to the end as we're going to start a new segment designed specifically for you. Now, if you weren't aware, Adobe rolled out some new tools in Lightroom for us to adjust our colors. We previously had split toning, and now we have color grading. And they're similar, but definitely color grading is more robust. We have more tools now at our fingertips than we've ever had before. So I'm going to walk through how I'm going to use them on a couple of different images just to kind of show you what it does, how it works, and how you could potentially use it with your photography. Now, for those of you that have watched the channel for a little while, know that I edit all of my photos on the iPad. I'm not going to go through every single setting. I am going to jump kind of right to color grading. These images have already been edited to a base, and then I'm going to go ahead and tweak just that color grading section just to show you what it does to those photos. Now, just because this is on the iPad doesn't mean this is only iPad. It does look a little bit different, but all of the tools are there on mobile as well as desktop. So this is going to apply kind of the tools, how they work, how they adjust the colors in your images will apply across devices. This is just what I've chosen to use, which is the 12.9-inch iPad from 2018 along with the Apple Pencil. Now I'm doing a top-down, hello, as well as a screen recording, so I'll jump between a few things to kind of show you the best that I can of what I am adjusting and what they're doing to the image. Now, to get us started, I'm going to jump into a photo of my wife. This was from a trip to Florida, visiting some friends at the beginning of the year before travel restrictions went into place. And it's a very bright image, a little bit overexposed. And again, I've already gone through and adjusted all of my basic adjustments. You can see I've adjusted exposure, contrast, all of that, as well as some of the color sliders, as well as effects. You know, you get the idea. I've adjusted all of these things that I want to adjust in the image. Now, previously, for split toning, you would go into effects, you'd scroll down to the bottom, and there'd be a little split toning option there for you. That is no longer there because split toning is now color grading. So it is now under the color panel. Now I have color mix and color grading. Color mix is where I want to edit a specific color. No matter where it's at in the image, if it's in your shadows or highlights, and let's say you want to adjust the greens, you would go specifically into your color mix, find the greens, and adjust from there. Now with color grading, this is a little bit different. And what we have here are a couple of different wheels, color wheels is what we're going to call them, and then a couple of sliders underneath those. So before we start making any changes, let's walk through what we have here so you understand what we're adjusting with each setting. At the top, you'll see that there are 4 circles. The first one is your shadows, which you can see labeled right underneath the color wheel. The second one is your midtones. Third one is your highlights. And then the fourth one is global. So any changes you make here are going to basically be a layer on top of the photo with all of the other edits beneath it. But for these, if I want to just make some color adjustments in my shadows, you want to be using that first circle, the first color wheel. And then there's a couple of ways that we can manipulate this. We have hue, saturation, and luminance. And then we'll come back to blending and balance afterwards because those are global settings for your color grade. Now, to get started with actually color grading this image, you can adjust the sliders in terms of the hue and saturation, and you can see as I adjust the saturation, you can see the green kind of coming in and out of the image, as well as your luminance of that green. Now, this isn't overbearing because, again, this is just in my shadows, and this photo in particular is a very bright, overexposed image, so it has a lot of highlights. There's not a ton of information in the shadows, and that was intentional. We'll get to some other images that are a little bit more balanced, as well as some that have more shadows to show you kind of the difference between those. So again, you can adjust the sliders here, or in the iPad version, which is really nice, this is one of the reasons I love using this, is you can just grab that circle on the color wheel and move it where you want. Now, the closer to the center, the less saturation it's going to have. The further out to the edge of the circle, the more saturation it's going to have. So you can see as I move this around, it changes the hue. You can see the hue slider moving exactly as I move the circle on the color wheel. And as I slide in and out, you can see the saturation in and out. Now, this is not a video on color theory. There's plenty of those on YouTube. I maybe will find one or two and link those for you. I am not necessarily a color theory expert, but I do know a couple of things that are helpful for me that I use. Now, with this, I like to use kind of the opposites. There's probably a special term for this. You want to use colors that are at the opposite ends of the color wheel that are complementary to each other in kind of your shadows and your highlights. And we'll get to the midtones in a moment. So for this image, I'm going to go ahead and maybe I want this to be, you know, a nice warm summery image, but I know that there is not as much information in the shadows. So if I want to be the opposite of that, I'm going to come over here to maybe this like bluish, tealish area, and I'm going to go ahead and slide that pretty far out just to kind of show you what it looks like. I may dial this back in afterwards. You don't want to go too heavy on this, but it does allow you to get a nice cinematic look if that's what you're going for, if you want to really dial in your color grading. Now that we have our shadow set, why don't we go ahead and move to our highlights. We'll come back to midtones. Again, as I was saying, I want this to be a warm, summery photo, so I'm going to go ahead and slide out into the oranges, the reds, things like that. See what that's doing to my highlight. Now you can see that's not necessarily doing the best things to this photo. It might feel if I pull in a little bit more. You can see this is starting to look a little bit like a vintage film look, and that's kind of cool. That may be something I actually like. So I'm going to just tweak that a little bit more. I don't want it to be overbearing. Pull that saturation back. And if you want to fine tune, that's where you have these sliders. You can kind of tweak just a couple of points as opposed to trying to dial it in on the color wheel. Now moving back to midtones, for me, this is where I get a little creative. And you can use some color theory and do like triangles and kind of go directly out one way or the other. Kind of like a little bit of this. It is cooling off the image a little bit, but it is kind of a look I'm enjoying. Now again, you can go to the globals and you can make some adjustments overall. You can do something, again, going for that warm summery look, trying to go into that warmth. To me, I would just use my warmth slider, my color temperature slider back in my other, if I go back here, under colors, I have my temperature. I would just use this as kind of my temperature gauge if I want this to warm up a little bit instead of a global adjustment. That is one way to use this color grading. Now, this isn't necessarily a look that I want to use on every single image, but this is one that makes it feel a little bit more nostalgic. Now, before we move on to the next image, I want to show you what blending and balance do. These are global adjustments to how the different color grading wheels are being applied to your image. Now, this image is, like we've said, very overexposed and has a lot of highlights. And so the balance is what we want to think about there, because right now it's very centered. All of the color grading, the shadows, midtones, and highlights are being applied evenly to those areas. But if I want this to be more in the shadows, the shadow adjustments to be a little bit more heavy, I can slide this down, and then that teal that we applied is becoming a little bit more prominent. If we slide this the other way, the orange that we had in the highlights is going to become more prominent. Now in this image, I'm going to slide it down just a little bit. I don't want to go too far. I kind of liked where we had it with the colors, but I do want to pull that back just a little bit. Now blending is a little bit different. Blending is the transitions between your shadows, your midtones, and your highlights. Blending at 50 right there in the middle is going to be a nice even transition. If I go all the way to the end and I make blending 1 or 0 or something like that, it's going to be very hard cuts between your shadows, your midtones, and your highlights. So there's not going to be a whole lot of bleeding of the teals into my midtones or the oranges into my midtones. And then the blue that I had in my midtones isn't really going to bleed out into either my shadows or highlights. Where if I go the other way, all the way out, It's going to be a very slow transition between each section of this photo. So the orange that I've applied to the highlights is going to bleed much more into those midtones. It's going to affect more of the image than when I had it at maybe 50 or lower. And that's the same on the other end. Those teals that we have in the shadows are going to bleed way more into the midtones of the image than we did before. Now for me, I generally want to keep this at 50 unless I'm seeing some of the colors get muddy and maybe overlap and conflict a little bit and those colors not pop quite as much. But in that case, I would pull the blending down so that it really defines each color in its section. That might help in some cases. For me, I'm mainly going to be sticking to 50. All right, let's move on to the next image. This is from that same trip, but this is a much more balanced photo, so you can see what the color grading does to a much more balanced photo. You can see here up in the histogram all of the colors right there in the middle, as opposed to if I go back to the other image that we started with, you can see all the way to the right hand side a big spike right there at the end, meaning all of those highlights are blown out. There is no data in there. That's helpful to know because therefore as I adjust my shadows, my midtones, and my highlights, I know how much of the image is being impacted. So in this image, my midtone adjustments are going to have a much bigger impact than on the previous image, and my highlight adjustments are going to have much less of an impact on this image. So let's dive in and I'm going to start playing again with these. I'm going to try and cool off this image a little bit. I know last time we went for a little bit more of a summer vibe, and this time I'm going to go a little bit more cool. So starting with some of the purple, magenta in those shadows, and I'm noticing this really in the ocean, in the water at the moment, and some of the blues on the actual pier that she's walking on. And then I'll jump into my midtones. I'm gonna slide out into the teal just a bit. That might even be too much. I can again just pull that saturation back. I might brighten this up a little bit. And now you can see there's really a blue tint to this image. But if I go to my highlights, now I'm going to go out into the greens. But that is probably a little bit too much. Pull that saturation back. Maybe go back into our midtones, pull that saturation back up a little bit. See, you have to adjust them, kind of one and the other, see how they impact one another, and then go ahead and tweak some things. Now, overall, I think our saturation might be getting a little out of hand, but if I go back to this, I might try tweaking my contrast. I might go back to my saturation and pull that up a little bit so that those colors that are in the image itself are really popping through and not getting hidden behind our color grading quite as much. And there you can see just a different take on the color grading, what it does to an image. Again, how our midtones really had an impact there because that's where the data is. That's what's in this image. It's a much more balanced photo than our previous one. And to go the other direction, we're going to skip to this image here in Chicago that is pretty heavy on the shadows. If you look at this histogram, there are some colors up there in the highlights, and that's going to be up in the sky there, but on the left-hand side of the histogram, there's a big spike at the very far end. That's all of our shadows. Now, I have gone in on our basic light adjustment panel and pulled up those shadows, but you can see if I tweak that a little bit, there are some deep shadows there in the bottom left. So I'm going to pull those up, but we know that as we go in to make the color grading adjustments, that's where that color is going to come in. So whatever color I choose in the shadows is really going to be prominent in that bottom left hand side of the image, and anything that we do in our highlights is going to be in the sky, maybe the building there. And our midtones, there's not a ton in there, but it's going to be some of the transitions on maybe the darker side of the building or the train. And we'll get a sense of that as we actually go and make these adjustments. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and jump into our color grading. I'm going to start with the shadows. Why don't we go ahead and do kind of a classic teal and orange. I'm going to pull that shadow out into the oranges. And that's probably overkill. I'm going to do a little bit overkill on this image just so you can see it in a dramatic sense. Again, this is really impacting this bottom left area of the image. I'm going to pull our luminance probably down a little bit. As I pull up, it gives it that faded look, which is cool probably a couple years ago, but I'm not in love with it at the moment, so I'm going to pull that luminance down just by 10. Then I'm going to jump to my highlights, and we'll go the opposite direction. We're going to go into the teal. Again, this was probably also cool on Instagram a couple years ago. And this is how you can get that look, is through your color grading. So I think that's probably a little bit much, so I can pull the luminance up on that one. And then in our midtones, this is going to be right here in the train area, and like I said, on this shadow side of the building. So I'm going to throw some purple in there. Just the tiniest bit of pink, magenta-y. I'm actually going to pull that back even more. Pull that luminance up to about 35. And then this is an area where I know that the image is very shadow heavy there on the left. And so I want the balance to maybe pull up a little bit and not be quite as orange there on the bottom. Not be quite as impacted there. So I'm going to pull my balance up. Blending, I'm going to leave it 50. I like the transitions here. You can see if I do this, again, the shadows get a little harsh. And if I go all the way up, you can see in those midtones that orange blend in as well as the teal. So that to me looks a little gross. So I'm going to pull that back to where that train still looks natural, which I think is right at 50. There you can see another image that's very shadow heavy and what the different color wheels do to these images. Now the last image is one that you can find on my Instagram, a final edited version of this. This was not done with color grading in this sense, but I've already edited this photo and, like I said, posted it, so there is a final version. But I'm going to go ahead and try this again and again show you a little bit of how you can take this too far and why you want to use this in moderation, because this image is very balanced. Why don't I go ahead and I'll show you a little bit of the histogram. It is balanced in a different sense than the other one that we talked about. This is balanced because I have all of the data. I'm not peaking on my highlights or my shadows, but I don't have a ton in the middle either. So I have a lot in the shadow and a lot in the highlights, but neither of them are peaking and I've lost the data there. But if I go into the color grading, what you'll see is, let's start with highlights this time, is that it's going to be the sky. It's going to be all the bright areas in the sky there. And if I go ahead and I maybe want this to look a little bit more pastel-y, right? I want this to look like it was just a banger of a sunset. I can maybe creep out there a little bit, pull the luminance down, just get some of that to pop more. And there you go. That in and of itself looks pretty good, right? I didn't impact anything in the foreground. All of the trees still look pretty natural, but the sky has a much more aesthetically pleasing look to it. Now, if I go to the shadows and I try and do something as well, maybe pop some more green in there. And again, I'm going to intentionally go a little out of control here. As you can see, it easily starts to look like this is not natural. I've never seen grass look that green before, that color of green before, and it's even going up into the yellow trees. And so this is really getting to a point that isn't pleasing, isn't natural. And then in our midtones, I'm going to put some yellow back in there. Try and warm this up. This was a nice fall day. And there you go. Now this is an image, again, that this is overkill. This is why you want to use these in moderation. You want to pull these things back. You want to pull the saturation back. Back in the shadows in particular, I want to pull that back. And I even probably want to go into a yellow is more of what I want here to make this a little bit more of a fall feeling. The grass hadn't really died at this point. You can see all the leaves in the trees had changed, but the grass was still pretty green. And so I'm going to pull back that saturation. I'm going to put in some of that yellow to make the grass feel like it's dead and not go overkill. So you can see where I'm at with saturation. Where I was previously was way out here with that green, and that just made it not look natural. So there you go. I hope that was helpful to you. Let me know what questions you have down in the comments. If you have other ideas on how to use this color grading. I love that Adobe is rolling out new features like this to desktop, tablet, and mobile. It really makes a difference for us as artists and gives us the tools to really make the images that we want to make. Now, for that new segment that I was talking about, we're going to do a new thing to celebrate you, the community. That's what I want to build here on this channel, is a community of photographers, storytellers. Yes, we're going to talk about the technology, but also the photos that we're making, why we're making them, and how we can make the best images possible. And to do that, I want to celebrate some of you. In each video, I'm going to find a subscriber or follower on social media that is doing amazing work and highlight them here. I hope that you will submit your images to me every once in a while. Send me a DM on Instagram or Twitter. Tag me in your photos as well. I would love to see what you're working on. So our first community member that we want to celebrate here is Paul Farace. He is a photographer down in Florida, just doing some amazing landscape work. When I look at his Instagram, there is one photo that sticks out that I'm in love with. He's in Georgia in a forest area, and there's light coming in and hitting this fog that gives this contrast behind a single tree that still has some orange leaves on it. And it just is a total vibe in this image that really, really sticks out to me. So well done, Paul. I also think that there are some amazing photos just of using the resources around him. He lives in Florida, which means he has access to the ocean. He has access to things that I don't have access to in terms of the type of trees, palm trees, things like that, that here in Chicago don't really exist. And so I'm taking photos of the things that are around me. Paul's taking photos of the things that are around him. So take that away and do the same. Find what's around you, find what's unique to your place where you live, especially in these times where we can't do much traveling, and use the tools you have. Use your camera, use your phone, whatever it is, get out there and make some photos because they are going to be unique, and it's the practicing and taking photos that's going to make you better. So give this video a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, and we will check you in the next one.